So we'll come back to versions and versioning and managing versions later after spring break. But I want to switch gears again and go to workflow mapping. So this is your reflection three. So this is important to kind of follow. Um, so workflow mapping, we talked about workflows, I think in unit one, where I showed you this really complicated set of workflows that are intersecting and we had these different rules for the workflow. You would go through our workflow and you might stop at a certain point and make a decision, or you might switch to another workflow. And so I kind of got into that there, but this is where we kind of think about what a workflow is and how to do this sort of mapping from our processes in our organization to a diagram, which we can then use to make decisions or understand our process better. So any organizational process can be converted into a workflow diagram. We have usually they're boxes and arrows. So I'll show you an example in the next slide. But we want to kind of keep this at the level of thinking about this is a system. And so when we have our workflow diagram, we can start very simply, and then we can elaborate on it later. We can sometimes make edits to the workflow and make it simpler. Sometimes we need to maybe take some extraneous steps out. Sometimes we have to add steps in. But when we make these diagrams, we can get a starting point where we can see what we have and then kind of refine it from there. So some of our goals should be some sort of process-oriented refactoring. So I talked about refactoring is something that we do in programming to rewrite a program to make sure that we can kind of work out a lot of the problems, a lot of the bugs, a lot of the inefficiencies. So that's what we want to do with our workflows. We want to start off with something that's good enough and then work until it gets optimized. So the first thing is we want to refine our process with discussions. So we want to use our discussion forums and we want to use our feedback boards to give information about how people work, how their process, how they might walk through a process, and then characterize that in a diagram. So we want to refine our processes with discussions. If we create an initial diagram, we want feedback from our team to see if that's the correct way that they think about it. We want to make sure that people, aren't using different methods. Maybe we need to create multiple workflows, maybe not, but we have to refine that with discussions. We also want to think about workflow mapping as a method for visualizing processes. So, how can we improve and analyze our process? And usually it's through this visualization method. When we visualize it, we reveal shortcomings of our current processes. We can identify next steps or like the next logical steps, and we can engage in decision making. So once we have our workflow mapped out, we can look at it and say, do we need any additional steps? Maybe we're missing something. And when you describe it verbally, sometimes you give people, like say you give people directions to travel somewhere, and you kind of give the directions, and sometimes you give good enough directions. You don't describe the entire route, you describe landmarks or things like that. And then maybe you can make it there, maybe you can't. So you need to really, if you draw that out on a map, it becomes much easier to understand, maybe where you don't have the right amount of information and so forth. So this is all to say that your graphical representation can help you identify where you need to improve. And then a lot of workflow mapping improves communications within and between teams. If I give people a workflow map, they can understand what they need to do. If they have a workflow map, oftentimes you can put this as sort of a community standard. It can make sure that people do the same process again and again. So this is an example of a workflow map. This is boxes and arrows. Sometimes you use different types of graphs, and we'll see what they look like in a minute. This is from workflowautomation.net, and this is a blog post on workflow mapping to give you a little background into how people use this in project management. This is a workflow for data science analysis. So this is just an example of what a workflow would look like if we wanted to say, acquire some data from a programming interface. We have a number of steps we need to oversee and make sure that we do correctly and get to an end. So remember in unit 1, I talked about workflows being like this set of things that you do or these set of decisions you make to get to an endpoint. And then when you get to the endpoint, you're at the end of it. So this is where we have an API programming interface. We acquire the data, we clean the data, then we set up an interactive notebook. And that interactive notebook has things coming in perpendicular to that. So you have an archival step and a cloud server step. So you need to host the notebook somewhere. You need to maybe archive the notebook. So those are steps that intersect with this workflow. We need to then analyze the data in the interactive notebook, visualize the data. Then we might have a community review of our data analysis. So we're not just doing this in a vacuum, we're interacting with our team. Then we have this quality control step. So our community review, maybe the same thing as quality control or separate, but we have this review step that's again perpendicular to our workflow for data science analysis. And then we release, and that's the end of the workflow. Make a release of the data set or the analysis. So this is your workflow. And you can think that, well, yeah, there are a lot of other steps in your list. Well, that's kind of the point. You want to put the steps in. You might take out extraneous steps. We might change our protocol. We might, enhance our protocol. So each one of these boxes is not just, a step. It might be 10 steps, but we have the main step defined, and then we can define things within that box. And, that just refines our workflow. So workflow process mapping, this is an article from gravityflow.io. It talks about 5 tips for painless workflow process mapping. So they talk about these 5 tips. One of the tips they give is that the goal is organizational improvement. You don't need to map every single process, but workflow process mapping can help understand your main processes that maybe have the most steps, give people the most trouble in terms of adhering to. So you don't want to map every single process in the organization. You want to map the processes that are, again, the most problematic. You want to identify key people, resources, and steps. So I showed you that, I identified a bunch of steps and some perpendicular workflows that give you resources, but I didn't put in key people. And that's something also you want to put into your workflow, is you maybe want to assign certain parts of the workflow to certain teams or certain people. Then you also want to modularize. So you don't want to just kind of, you may make a list of every step in a process. But another strategy to this, especially if you have a very complex system or you have a large organization, is to modularize your workflow process map. And then from those modules, you add in detail underneath. So we might have a process where we have a design step, a production step, and a maintenance step. And then we just think about those 3 things. And then in those 3 modules, we pick things within that processes within each of those steps. And that gives us our workflow that might be 20 steps long, but we've started with these 3 modules because we want to think of it in terms of function or teams. So each team can define the details, outline conforms to community standards. So each team maybe will refine each thing that they're responsible for. If you have a maintenance step, you don't just rely on a manager saying, this is what we need to do for maintenance. You get the people involved in maintenance involved in building that workflow. We also want to determine specific action items. So what type of process is needed to accomplish the workflow component? What do we need in place to accomplish the box, to get to the next box via the arrow? So sometimes we don't have those processes worked out. Sometimes we do. We also want to think about 2 different ways of 2 different things that go on in these process maps. which are transformational changes and transactional changes. The transformational changes is when you turn one thing into another. So in the data science analysis pipeline, we're going from raw data to graphs or interesting relationships. Transactional might be different. It might be where you are giving something to someone else, or you're passing off some materials to someone else, or you're relying on social interactions. And so these are different sets of processes that you can diagram. They have different results, so you should keep that. Then we should start simply and formalize later. So don't try to get everything into the first version of a workflow process map. Just try to start with small, maybe start in a modular. Start with a couple of boxes, that describe different functions or different teams, and then work down and say, we'll refine each part of this. Or start with a few steps and then think, what are the intermediate steps? Your discussion should allow teams to sketch out details in a shared notes doc. So we talked about how if we do something like a shared notes doc, we might do this in Notion, and then we might build this on top of a discourse instance where we have a discussion group or a discussion forum that then, they talk about this issue. We take notes on that discussion, and then we mine those notes for specific action items. So this involves setting up a tech stack, but it also involves surveying and getting feedback. Then you also want to assign responsibilities. So who is responsible for what part of the workflow? Sometimes you want to have editors of the workflow. You don't want to just let anyone edit the workflow, because you want to have the same people updating it. Because if you have a version 1 of the workflow, you want version 2 to be consistent with that. You want the thought processes behind it to be consistent, and so forth. So we need to have curators of discussions, editors of workflows, and some chain of, accountability, or someone updating the workflow and making sure it's valid. So this is an example of a workflow. Sometimes if you have a discussion about what should be in a workflow, and you want to take that from a discussion group to a formal workflow, you might have a design step like this. And this is something called a swim lane map. So this is where in design, what they love to do is they like to write ideas on sticky notes, stick them on a board, and then those sticky notes are all over the place. And the idea is to organize them in some meaningful way. So this is where they're organized into these swim lanes. So you have these perpendicular processes. You have these processes that go horizontal, vertical, and then they intersect. So, again, these rows, these swim lanes, and these columns, also swim lanes, are just, processes, pathways where all these things kind of line up. You do one thing after another thing after another thing. And you put them like this, and you see where they intersect. So you know kind of where workflows will intersect, where there maybe needs to be a decision point. So if I get to the point of storing data on a cloud server, there's a whole cloud server workflow that intersects there, and it informs that decision. So this just shows a way to sort of get from discussions or thinking about things to the workflow. That's just one tool. Another tool are these process mapping sessions, which are a little more formal. And so this is sometimes the swim lane will come out of these sessions. And these are meetings where people will, propose different ways to do this mapping. And there's this article from the BPM Institute on how to facilitate a successful process mapping session. And again, it's where you have your team and you're asking them, how do we do this process? What are the steps? What do they look like? How do we organize this? Now, there's a sort of a temptation when you do this to describe everything that you do in the organization. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to map every process. We want to map a single process. We want those steps in order. We want to be able to simplify things before we make them more complex. So one of the problems is if you just throw everything out on the table, is you can have what we call scope creep, which means that we ask a simple question, and we get a massive amount of output. And it's hard to know where the scope of the workflow actually is. So you have to be mindful of scope creep, and you want to be able to capture just the right amount of information, and it's not easy. So there are 3 steps. There are 3 tips for this. The first is to define your core steps. And those core steps should be 6 points or less. So we might just think very simply about a process in terms of 4 or 5 steps, or we might use that modular approach, where you define teams or you define stages, and then you work from there and you refine those. You then drill down on the core steps. You look for processes within processes. So you start with maybe 3 steps, and then you think for each of these steps, what's involved in this? For something like data science, if you work with an API, there are probably like 25 steps within it. So that might be a perpendicular workflow to that API box, or it might be within the API box. You have to do this to get to the next step. Then we have to describe each process step by step. So again, that's logical. It seems logical, but it's hard. Like I said, sometimes you give people directions to a location, and the directions are not very good, and people get lost. That's because you describe something step by step, but you didn't give enough information to get from point A to point B. And so you can have that with process maps, where you have, you kind of describe things as they kind of come into your head, but you miss a bunch of detail. And so it's hard to kind of get from the beginning to the end. So this is an example of a process map where you have different levels. So in this organization, they do product development, customer ordering, customer fulfillment, customer service. That's level 0. That just defines kind of what they do. Maybe it ships them. Then level 1 is where you take each of these boxes in level 0, break them out into their own process. So customer fulfillment is order materials, production, picking, shipping. And they're experts in those areas, people who work in those areas, who can inform what's involved in those in customer fulfillment, but also then what's involved at level 2, or within each of these boxes in level 1. If we take production, we break it out. It's mixing, filling, sealing, packing. And now you see that we've gone from this 4-stage process map to 16 to, I don't know what this number is, but it's going to be a lot, 16 times 4. And so that's going to be a very large number of processes. But each one of those are kind of nested in the next level up. And that involves a whole totally different set of expertise. So largely, if you're like doing customer fulfillment, you're only interested in the 16 steps in that and not anything else. So, it's useful to the people doing that thing. You have the entire map worked out. So it's workable. Again, with process mapping sessions, we want to make sure that the right people are in the discussion. We want to make sure that the experts, the people actually doing the work, are in the discussion so they know what the steps are. If you ask a manager to define the steps, they might not give a very good answer because they're not doing it day to day. You want to tag the appropriate code owners, leaders, and specialists in a GitHub repository. You'll often have code owners. In a sprint, you also have code owners who will kind of know the product inside and out. You also, leaders and specialists will help you as well. You also want to use discussion channels and structured meetings. So you want to be, maybe if you have a virtual meeting in Zoom, you want to build that on top of a discourse instance. So you can go to that discourse instance, ask people directly, what does this mean? And then work it out on a whiteboard in Zoom. So there's a tech stack involved in these process mapping sessions. If you're working with your team, that's quite important to kind of maintaining this chain of, getting from kind of this idea of a process to the formal map. And then, of course, we have, different types of meetings. So we have cross-functional meetings. We have functional meetings. And those meetings can, we can either have meetings between teams or meetings kind of directly related to the topic. and there are pros and cons for each approach. So if I'm building like, the workflow that I showed you in factory where they're fulfilling an order, I might have a cross-functional meeting with everyone and go one by one, step by step by step, and drill down to the most basic steps for each part. Or I might meet with the teams individually and I might say, okay, I'm going to work on product fulfillment. We'll work on that, and then we'll move to the next team. And those teams will be separated out. There are pros and cons for each. And, it depends on the culture of your organization. Maybe, one team does a lot of different things. So it might make sense to have everyone in the